The following is an excerpt taken from Hendrik van Riessen's The Society of the Future, and more specifically from Chapter 3, titled Structural Principles of Society. The religious background. To understand the principles of the balance of authority and freedom and sphere sovereignty, it is necessary to trace their religious significance. Only if such is kept in view can a merely formal manipulation be avoided. According to the first chapter of Genesis, God created nature in an orderly fashion, endowing each facet with its own distinct nature. He then created man in his own image. Man was created as a master builder. Man's duty was not only to maintain the creation, but also to add to it by developing its latent possibilities. Man's official task was to cultivate the potentialities inherent in creation. Reflection on this state of affairs in the light of Scripture discloses much that is perplexing, and the fall into sin renders the situation still harder to understand. And yet a few things are intelligible. Everything that is created is of a religious meaning structure, i.e., it has to serve God. It exists for God's glory and for his unsearchable good pleasure, and unto that end he has subjected it to his laws. Man is also subject to the latter, but God granted him freedom, that he might be responsible for his deeds. An important manifestation of his freedom is that man may unfold the plan of creation. The wealth of creation forbids us to think of it as being rigid and simple. But it must be remembered that man in his freedom does not make anything wholly new. He unveils in the course of history such works as God has laid out for him at creation. In all probability, man performs only part of this task, and what he does is still faulty and misshapen, and there is sure to be a good deal of possible work undetected. Nevertheless, no other possibility is open to him than to follow the main lines of the plan of creation. In nature, everything has its own peculiar character. Likewise, what man constructs in the sphere of culture has its own peculiar nature. Sin may hinder the production of a sound structure. Its infection may cause deformity. Sin may blind man to the latent potentialities of culture. But all that man does and leaves undone is directed by the structures of creation. He may establish a disorderly family, but it is still a family. He may form a totalitarian state, but it is still a state. A powerless church, nevertheless a church. An asocial project, still a project. A useless bridge, but a bridge. An insipid novel, nevertheless a novel. Among such structures, the relationships of society occupy an important place. In his responsibility to God, man stands together with others. It is here that the idea of human community is encountered. At this point, one must guard against a dangerous misconception. Such a fellowship is not an equalizing collection, embracing all of humanity, or a race or nation. It is in such a sense that the alternative between the individual and a community is forced upon us. The individual is then secondary, and the community is primary. Such a view commits idolatry with respect to the community. As aforetime, perhaps in America still at present, the individual was idolized. And it leads already in thought to a totalitarian society, in which the life of man is regarded as a service to the community, rather than as a religious devotion to God. The criticism of this idea of a community is one of the main features of this book. Such an idea of a community would liquidate sphere sovereignty. A community is always qualified by a determining meaning function. It is never something indefinite. Accordingly, each relationship has of necessity a specific structure, and this structure depends upon the meaning of such a community. This holds even in experiments with groups. William Foote White blames the failure of such of the experiments of group discussion by the Research Center of Group Dynamics at the University of Michigan on a lack of group structure and of corresponding tasks. A community is always determined and limited by the nature of the activity jointly performed, e.g. family life, union work, technical production, scientific research. Such a limitation concerns the number of people constituting the group, the reason for their grouping, and the duration of the group. Man functions in a group in a qualified sense, without the loss of his personal identity. His personal identity is not to be merged in any single relationship, nor in the totality of his relationships. Man does not exist for the sake of any form of society. Within the limits of a lasting social relationship, however, man shares a common task. Such cooperation and communal living does not originate automatically. Affairs must be regulated and order maintained. Unto that end, authority is instituted, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life, in 1 Timothy 2, verse 2. On Paul's return after his circuit through Asia Minor, he establishes order by officially ordaining elders over the congregation. See Acts 14, verse 23. The bearers of authority in such a social unit do not derive their competence from their own volition, nor from the will of the people in their social unit. The Lord endows them with authority. On the other hand, they don't have such authority for their own sake, nor are they in every respect the link between the original source of their charge and their subordinates. They occupy their office in order that, in a qualified cooperation or communal life, men may come to the fulfillment of their function, to their cultural calling, in direct free responsibility to God, who calls them into his service. That is the key to the principle of authority and freedom. Authority and freedom constitute a balance, aiming in a constructive sense at the coordination of a qualified cultural mandate. Such a balance would moreover protect human labour in such a social unit from the permeation of sin, especially from individualism. It would ward off the arbitrary and improper use of freedom, and it would prevent the inversion of the order of authority and freedom through the usurpation of power. A despot does not understand his authority ought to establish an environment in which, with the greatest possible freedom of action, men may follow their combined calling to carry out their qualified cultural task. There is something more to be said concerning authority. It can be localized, it ought to have real power, and it may not be confused with leadership in general. Authority can be localized in a person, in a group, or in a very complicated hierarchical structure, but it must always be distinguished from the people upon which authority is exerted. A so-called democratic leadership, that according to group dynamics theory diffuses all leadership through the whole group, has nothing to do with authority, leadership, or democracy. When the discussion leader in the aforecited group discussion changes his role to a mere resource person, the group is confused and is paralyzed in its functioning. Democracy in a group or in a community does not mean that decisions are taken without an authorized leader, but it means decisions of the group under the guidance of a leader, provided a proper balance of authority and freedom is established. Leadership belongs to the created structure of groups or qualified communities, or, otherwise stated, it belongs to the freedom of men operating together in a qualified sense. But to be effective, leadership ought to have power. Only if power is derived from a constitution can such leadership be called authority. The personal aspect is, of course, not irrelevant to the obedience to parents, the government, or a supervisor, but this obedience depends fundamentally upon the constitution by which authority is established, as a delegation from the authority of Christ. Even if such constituted leadership is not effective due to a serious lack of personal power or wisdom, e.g. in a factory, other and in that case informal leadership will emerge and take over. Such leadership and, in general, leadership without a constitution will depend solely upon personal qualities. It has no real authority, although it may be of use. From the fact that each form of society is so qualified that it is endowed with its own peculiar nature, the qualified structure of the social units, it is clearly evident that the organ of authority in one relationship cannot rightly seek to exert itself in a relationship of another nature. In other words, the authority in one sphere cannot rightly be transferred to that of another. It cannot rightly regulate the other sphere. Sphere sovereignty is inherent in the created structure of things, and it is an expression of God's absolute sovereignty over his creation in Christ. The subordination of a qualified authority to another of a different kind, e.g. the subordination of parents to a consistory, of the direction of an enterprise to the government, deforms the order of creation. Moreover, it shifts to human institutions the responsibility the office bearers owe to God. The maintenance of sphere sovereignty concerns the sovereignty of God over life, the authority granted to Christ. This order of creation, moreover, restrains the influence of sin. The distribution of power in many independent forms of society prevents the concentration of power, and it is the accumulation of power that man is tempted to abuse. Popes and despots have taught us that much. In practical life, sphere sovereignty also leads to a balance. The various organized units of society constitute an equilibrium of many social forces. When one begins to attain preponderance and to endanger the independent existence of the others, forces are thereby aroused which tend to restore equilibrium. The process is, apart from the question of responsibility, analogous to the way in which diseased bacilli activate forces of resistance in a body. It should be clear that neither of these principles is the result of an abstract theory. They are fruits of scriptural reflection upon the formation of society. Next section, the relation between the various societal relationships. Up until now, only the independent existence of the various societal units or relationships has been treated. Such forms of society are, however, also related to each other. Lines of influence run back and forth, intermingling and inspiring each other. Well then, such influence is properly exercised if it conforms to the nature of the social organisation exerting it. The Church ought to remind the state, parents and all other persons in authority, together with those owing allegiance, of what the Word of God demands from them. The products of an enterprise and their economic value exert an influence, e.g. upon circumstances within the family. In virtue of their special calling with regard to their children, parents have a right to make demands in school or in the military service. The state properly takes cognizance of economic life by providing public legal protection in its commerce and business enterprises. There is, however, another influence. Each authority is responsible for the affairs of its own sphere. The protection and development of this sphere affects demands and conditions valid for other spheres. The state may properly develop and maintain national conditions favourable to an equitable commercial life, e.g. the guarantee of the value of its currency. The state exceeds its function when it interferes in economic life by determining individual conditions affecting credit that properly belong to the individual decisions of the enterprise concerned. The digging of canals and public power projects, such as Boulder Dam, concern national conditions affecting the economic life, but also have a broader reach. For the digging of canals and the reclamation and cultivation of inundated territory, e.g. are not limited solely to economic life. They enable life to unfold in all its rich variety of facets and relationships. Confusion arises on this point because, in keeping with the time, the content of the economic sphere is taken in too wide a sense. Our society is at present so deformed that it is difficult to make our meaning completely clear. An example taken from a sphere that is still somewhat normal may help. Parents have the right and the duty to control and to regulate matters in their family, in order to make possible the free development of their children for their life's vocation. The state has nothing to regulate within a family, between families, or between a family and a business, because this is not in accordance with its meaning. It has its own domain to regulate. It ought to care for the public milieu by maintaining and cultivating public conditions favourable to national life, e.g. work on pavements, sidewalks, and the development of public territory. Consequently, among other things, the state, in keeping with its proper and necessary function, thereby provides the family with a structure in which it can function. The economic spheres, for their part, accordingly condition the family, e.g. with wages and labour hours. Moreover, public authorities may be properly concerned with a family, with its relation to other families, and with the relation of family and industry. Their task is not with a family's internal order and affairs, nor with the external relations with other families in general, however, but with the establishment of justice. Even its preoccupation with justice is not universal. Not all injustice is a matter for the state. Only in border situations is it proper for the state to establish justice by interfering in the private lives of its citizens, as individuals and members of groups. That is, in such instances where injustice and need would otherwise be intolerable, e.g. extensive unemployment, cruelty to a child, insufferable neighbourhood rows, etc. Summarising, we can conclude that the family is governed by its parents, and that the government of the nation acts in various border situations of the family. In the first place, the government provides the public conditions for family life. Then the government has to act in case of an emergency caused by acts of injustice or by serious distress. The state may act, for example, in severe unemployment threatening a family with dissolution. The state may interfere to protect a family's right to exist, or to protect the rights of its members, e.g. in divorce cases. An emergency may also arise where it may become necessary to protect society against the family, as in the case of infectious disease. And in cases of cruelty, the rights of a child may need to be protected by its removal from parental control. It is easy to understand that in some of these examples, it is also possible for the government to have a right and a duty to act, viz. If the national well-being is at stake, unemployment, infectious diseases, etc. The relation between the state and economic life should be conceived analogously. The state ought not to regulate or direct economic life in such a way that it places its own authority above the authorities proper to the economic sphere. But the state ought to maintain and develop favourable national and local public conditions in which the economic sphere can properly flourish. And in borderline cases of distress, emergency or injustice, the state ought protectively to put matters aright. The government may have to deal with some intolerable distress or injustice concerning private persons or social units, and even at times with some menace to its own sphere. I have yet to hear an argument, biblical or otherwise, in support of the contention that unlike the coordinate relation between family and state, the economic sphere ought to be subordinate to the state. An appeal to a factual situation is no argument for the correctness of the situation. It implies no more than that we must put up with it until we are able to restore the proper relation of coordination. If a person has $1 million, in general that is no business of mine, nor of the government. A man owes responsibility to God for his stewardship. But when he uses it to perpetrate an injustice, the government has the right to step in. And if an emergency arises, the government may make a coercive appeal to such a person for assistance. If the government wants to go any further, e.g. arbitrary appropriations, an ideal society is not thereby obtained. Man simply loses his accountability to God, and total power is granted to the state. Our exposition and the example cited here do not pretend to provide exhaustive instruction for general application. Such instruction cannot be drawn up. Every problem concerning the interrelations between social groups is new. It requires continual reflection upon and interpretation of the peculiar character of the social relationships involved. And even if such reflection is successful, the question is still not solved. For example, even if we know what the authorities may rightly do and what they ought to forego, the question still persists, whether under the given circumstances the government ought here to exercise its right to interfere in the life of another sphere. There is always a spectrum of emergencies, and likewise it holds that even if we understand the significance of authority and freedom in social relationships, it must still be determined in each separate instance where the balance ought to lie. Man is continually placed before such practical decisions, connected not only with particular circumstances, but with the historical moment. After weighing all the factors, a compromise conclusion must be reached. Such is life, and luckily so. It would be of small interest if every solution to life's problems were written in a field manual. Well-meaning, practical people are, therefore, often inclined to trust their common sense exclusively. They uproot the guideposts of principles and rely on their keen nose. The risk of a keen nose, however, is that it can, with equal ease, adapt itself to a perfumery or to a cow barn. Without the anchorage provided by principles, we drift along with the stream of social events. But someone will say, what is the use of a principle such as sphere sovereignty? It may teach in a general way the nature of the state and of some other organized social units, but in a borderline situation, where decisions are made, the clarity of our distinctions grow vague. Let us answer with an example. In a spectrum, various tints lie between red and orange, concerning which it is impossible to say if they are one or the other. Such obscurity might lead us to the faulty denial of the existence of red and orange, but the little that can be said about such a borderline situation can be said only because of the distinction between green and red.